cold open, a GOA versus Belt and Road. In recent years, the dynamics of Africa's trade relationships have been shifting. On one hand, Washington has implemented tariffs that are slowly suffocating trade flows between the United States and African nations. Meanwhile, Beijing is quietly orchestrating a massive infrastructure push, building a sprawling supply corridor throughout the continent. With U.S. tariffs pushing the cost of everything from textiles to cobalt to unprecedented heights, the African market is experiencing a trade disruption. While the U.S. imposes tariffs, China moves in, leaving behind not just loans, but entire railways, port upgrades, and an expanding industrial presence, shifting the value of Africa's exports to Chinese ports. In this evolving landscape, Africa finds itself at a crossroads. U.S. tariffs, which initially targeted inflation control, are becoming a strategic battleground, where Washington might lose its economic grip on the continent, handing Beijing a competitive edge. The question remains, is this the beginning of a permanent shift in influence from Washington to Beijing in Africa? Or is this just a temporary consequence of tariff escalation? Let's take a closer look at how this trade shift is playing out and what the U.S. is losing as a result of these new tariffs. If you found this video insightful, don't forget to hit that subscribe button. Stay tuned for more updates and content. We've got plenty more coming your way. Tariff timeline. The U.S. struggles. The situation began to take shape in 2024 when Washington's new tariff regime kicked off at a modest 10%. By the summer of 2025, that number had skyrocketed to an average of 17%, with some goods experiencing even higher rates. This aggressive tariff policy has begun to make a noticeable impact on African exports to the United States. According to the most recent trade data, U.S. imports from Africa plunged dramatically between 2024 and 2025. Exports of textiles, processed foods, rare metal alloys, and specialty chemicals, once staples of African trade to the U.S., dropped by an alarming 28%. This was accompanied by a 22% decrease in tonnage and a 7.6% spike in the average price of these goods due to the tariffs. This is a sharp blow to industries in Africa that relied on favorable tariff conditions, such as the textile and automotive sectors. The impact on African exporters. The impact of the tariff hikes has been devastating for African exporters. For instance, the textile sector in Kenya, a key exporter of apparel to the U.S., saw a 29% decline in its exports to the U.S. in the fourth quarter of 2024. This drop mirrors a broader trend across the continent as African countries, traditionally reliant on the U.S. market, find themselves being squeezed out by the rising cost of doing business with the U.S. It doesn't stop there. African nations that once enjoyed trade benefits under the African Growth and Opportunity Act, AGOA, are now faced with losing access to a key market. The AGOA, which allowed African countries to export goods to the U.S. duty-free, is effectively being undermined by the increasing tariffs. And as the U.S. loses its appeal, China steps in. China's growing presence. Where the U.S. struggles, China accelerates. The Chinese government has been laying down the groundwork for the Belt and Road Initiative, BRI, to boost its presence in Africa, and it's paying off. Between 2024 and 2025, Chinese imports from Africa increased by 18% in both volume and value. This is a clear indication that African nations are pivoting their exports to China in response to the tariff pressure from Washington. Moreover, the shift to China is not just about raw exports, it's about value-added goods. The Chinese government, through its XM loans in the China Development Bank, CDB, has been strategically investing in African infrastructure. The Djibouti-Addis Ababa Railway, funded by China, is a perfect example of how China is expanding its influence, ensuring that African exports are funneled into Chinese ports. Additionally, China's loan packages are helping to establish joint ventures with African countries in sectors such as textiles and agricultural products. For instance, a $1.2 billion loan for a manufacturing park in Kenya is helping the country establish a foothold in the textile and processed food industries, targeting markets in the Middle East and the European Union, effectively bypassing the U.S. market. Belt and Road Infrastructure. China's investments in Africa are not limited to loans and trade deals. The Belt and Road Initiative, BRI, is also designed to boost infrastructure, with new railways, ports, and logistics systems being developed across the continent. These improvements are creating new routes for African exports to bypass the US and reach Chinese ports faster and more efficiently. For instance, by 2025, the expanded railway lines in Kenya and Ethiopia will significantly improve the efficiency of transporting goods to Chinese ports, allowing Africa to increase its exports to China while avoiding the US tariff hurdle. This infrastructure revolution is positioning China to dominate the African export market in the long term. The growing debt trap. China's increasing presence through the Belt and Road also raises concerns about Africa's rising debt. As African governments take out loans for infrastructure projects, there are growing fears that these nations may fall into a debt trap due to the increasing reliance on Chinese financing. However, Beijing is attempting to soften this image by emphasizing its commitment to sustainable development and green credit frameworks. Countries like Kenya, Ethiopia, and Nigeria are engaging with China in manufacturing partnerships, moving away from the US and strengthening ties with China. China's ability to offer favorable financing, along with its growing trade deals, makes it an attractive partner for African nations, and this could signal a permanent shift in Africa's trade alliances. Strategic fallout for the US. The consequences of the US tariff hikes go beyond just economic losses. The US military presence in Africa, particularly its logistical operations in places like Djibouti, is at risk. With China's growing infrastructure footprint and its economic investments, Beijing is also strengthening its influence over key logistical hubs on the continent. This could result in Africa becoming a strategic battleground, not just for trade, but for geopolitical influence. Conclusion. The future of US-Africa trade. The US's move to increase tariffs on African goods, initially seen as an effort to curb inflation, is now having unintended consequences. While African countries suffer from reduced exports and higher tariffs, China is stepping in, using its Belt and Road Initiative to secure economic dominance. If you found this video insightful, don't forget to hit that subscribe button. Stay tuned for more updates and content. We've got plenty more coming your way.